John Nichols is a senior writer with The Nation magazine, one of the world's great repositories of public service journalism, debate and just some all-round fine writing. And it's fair to say that John's distinguished himself as a profound thinker and campaigner about journalism and democracy, and his latest book, The Death and Life of American Journalism, is an in-depth essay about both, and I think it gives us some thoughtful and perhaps radical ideas about how saving one can save the other. So it's my great pleasure to welcome John Nichols.
Let us begin. I greet you as our former President George W. Bush did when he ran into John Howard, who was his most committed ally in the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, and thanked Mr. Howard for that commitment, that support, and for sending the brave soldiers of Austria to fight with the U.S. I know that many of us in the U.S. can be neglectful of our Australian friends, but I think we would all share, I suspect our Australian friends will share, the sense that in this time we very much miss our former president, Mr. Bush, for journalistic reasons. He was a great delight to cover, and I'm intrigued by the fact that in watching this Australian election that you seem to be desirous of competing with us as regards putting up interesting characters. Although, bizarrely enough, we have yet to have the phenomenon of a Mark Latham. And when we do, I think we will have really achieved what you have politically. But I'm not sure what that is. Now, I hope you'll permit me in this political moment to reflect for just a moment on my own work, which is as a political journalist. And it began at the age of 11 in a little tiny town in what would be, I guess, best translated as the American outback, a place called Wisconsin, which is genuinely the middle of nowhere. And I grew up in a town of 970 people. I rode my bicycle down the main street at 11 to the office of the Union Grove Sun, which was our weekly newspaper. And I walked in and presented myself to Carl Kruger, who was the editor, the publisher, the photographer, the reporter, the printer, the layout guy, the ad salesman, and the janitor of the paper. Now, I understand that today that doesn't seem that weird because that's pretty much what media companies want us all to be. But he was also the owner of the publication. And I stood before him and I said, I have read the Constitution of the United States with regards to freedom of the press. I've read our Declaration of Independence. I've read Tom Paine. I have watched Woodward and Bernstein take down a president with the Watergate reporting. I know that journalism is the underpinning of democracy, and I am reporting for duty. And to give you a sense of what a small town it was, Carl said, I will give you $5 for each story and $1 for every picture that turns out. And I headed off on my bike to cover, all the politics and unusual doings of Union Grove, Wisconsin, which was, admittedly more exciting to an 11-year-old than perhaps an adult. But a year later, because we have these primaries to nominate our candidates for president. Wisconsin was a very hotly contested primary state, and through the sheer dumb luck of politics, Hubert Humphrey, the former vice president of the United States, a former presidential candidate, one of the great leaders of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, the man who wrote our civil rights plank and our civil rights legislation in America, came by bus to Union Grove to speak at our American Legion Hall on a Sunday night. And Humphrey's aides let it be known that after he spoke, he would be willing to answer some questions from the local media. At about 10 o'clock, I stepped onto the bus after my bedtime, and with my notepad containing more than 20 questions about the Vietnam War, economics, and many other issues, as well as my Polaroid camera, sat down opposite Mr. Humphrey and started asking him questions, which he politely answered for the better part of an hour and a half. I look back on that moment and realize that it was very possibly the high point of my journalistic career, while remarkably at the exact same moment, the low point of his political career. And I have devoted myself for the better part of 40 years since then to being the low point of politicians' political careers, which is what I think journalists should do. They shouldn't be happy to see us coming. And hopefully they will treat us as politely as Mr. Humphrey treated me, although I see that your Prime Minister is not welcoming Mr. Latham as he jumps aboard her campaign buses. So, as silly and romantic as that story may be, I remain exactly as I was back then, a genuine believer that journalism is the fundamental underpinning of democracy, and that those of us who practice this craft may do so because we love the smell of the computer. We used to love the smell of the printer's ink, but that's all gone. But we love the elements of the craft, I know that. But when we step back and ask ourselves why we continue to do this, why we remain committed to it, I think that most of us still go to that touchstone that says we are doing something useful, something fundamental for society. And I think it was best summed up, actually, by an Australian journalist, the great labor editor Henry Boot, who edited the AWU's paper for the better part of 40 years and was a great anti-conscription campaigner. But he wrote a poem called The Paper, and it's very short. It went, "Midst tempests of passion, midst whirlwinds of hate, it has stood with the masses as mate stands with mate, as at democracy's gate, repelling the onslaughts of treacherous foes, but always the one sacred duty it knows is the tyrant to dare and the traitor expose." The tyrant to dare and the traitor to expose. In America, we have different ways of saying it, to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. But the basic concept of why we do this is not to write a lifestyle story about how to be a little less fat. We do this because we want to challenge the tyrant, to expose the lie. And that is what people want us to do. That has been the historic and vital mission of journalism from the days of Tom Paine. And I quote Boot because I think it now falls more to Australia, perhaps, than any other country to maintain that mission. And I didn't come here to make you feel good. It's actually a rather burdensome challenge I put upon you, but it relates very closely to a lot of economic factors that we'll talk about. This is ultimately an optimistic speech. We will get to the optimistic part. But to get there, I'm going to have to bum you out a little. I mean, I'm probably make you feel really dismal. And I did disagree. I love Chris, but I disagree with one of the things he said. He said that Roy Greenslade was rushing along the decline of newspapers a little too rapidly. With all due respect, I know Roy pretty well. He's underestimated for a lot of countries. I mean, Australia may be doing okay, but the rest of the world, it's a little tough. So let me tell you about America. It's a cautionary tale. The United States of America never established a functional public broadcasting system. We thought it was some sort of communist thing. And so we were real scared about that. So we just didn't do it. We have no ABC, no BBC, no real equivalent of it. We have National Public Radio and a public television system which shows us wonderful nature shows about dolphins and things. And is, it's good. I appear on it every chance I get. It's wonderful. My mom loves it. But it is so understaffed, so minimally a part of our overall media experience that in our book, Bob and I joke about, we have this graph that shows the amount of money that Australia and Slovenia and Mali or wherever spends per person on public television. And then the line at the bottom, that's what the United States spends. I mean, it's just minimal compared to any place else in the world. So we never established a public broadcasting system. As a result, our television broadcasting and our cable broadcasting never had a standard against which to measure itself. And they have never tried. We have seen an absolute degeneration of broadcast television in the United States to the point where we now occupy several countries around the world but never report on it because it costs too much money to send television journalists out to tell you what's going on in Afghanistan. There was a point during the debate about whether the United States would dramatically increase its military presence in Afghanistan when Holland had more broadcast journalists on the ground in Afghanistan than the United States did. We don't cover the countries we occupy. That is the ultimate measure of empire, but it is also the ultimate measure of the decline of democracy. Because if you are a democracy and people are supposed to set their foreign policy, but they don't know what's being done in their name, but often without their informed consent, we see a collapse of the whole process. So we never established it. And now, at a moment when advertising is fleeing television, Pepsi-Cola just decided last year, for the first time in history, not to advertise on our biggest sporting events anymore. They're putting all their money into social media. So advertising flees television. There's less money there. What are our television stations doing? Laying off journalists. Because journalists are more expendable than cameras, more expendable than helicopters, more expendable than everything. You get rid of, we just need one technician there to turn things on, right? We can get film from someplace else. And so this is happening across the United States. We literally have situations in the U.S. now where we used to have competing television stations in a major market. Now one station produces the news for several different stations, and they just hire a very pretty young man or young woman to sit and announce the different stories and say, Television 27, TV 6, but it's the same stories on all of them. This complete dumbing down of the process. Also, we don't cover government on television, local television, the states anymore at all. We cover crime, lots of it, some sports, and then weather. We cover weather like you wouldn't believe in America. We are the kings of weather, let me tell you. Oh my gosh. Do you know that the average television newscast in the United States has, in a 22-minute newscast, 7 minutes of weather? And it's fabulous. I mean, you literally know the temperature in every neighborhood in every town. You know if there's a front developing over the Pacific. We know the weather in Australia. We may not know the Prime Minister's name, but we know the weather. And the incredible thing about it is that the weather, of course, is free. The government creates the weather. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. We have a national weather service in the United States. It gives you all the information for free, and so TV loves the weather because they get this whole package of information. They can put it up with graphics, but no journalism. So television moves to the side. What about radio in the United States? Well, we used to have incredibly competitive radio. We're a great big country, lots of radio stations. And then in 1996, we decided that we wanted to get rid of the old pre-World War II law. Before World War II, we passed a law in America that said one company couldn't own all the radio stations. That's a bad idea, because Hitler did that, and we didn't want to go that way. And so we had a law. You can't own a lot of radio stations. 1996, we thought, well, Hitler's been dead probably for a while. And so we get rid of that law. And one company now in the United States owns 1,200 radio stations. I mean, they took incredible debt to buy it, right? So how do they make money? I've got it. Lay off 19,000 on-air personalities in the last decade. 19,000 on-air personalities. DJs, hosts, reporters, weather people, all laid off. So television and radio really collapsing in, doing dramatically less journalism. But at least we've got the newspaper. Thank God for the newspaper, right? The big, giant newsroom covering every bit of our community, sending out dedicated young reporters, 11-year-olds with cameras to interview vice presidents. But every town's got a big newspaper, hundreds of reporters, and even if radio and television's not rising to the occasion that we've got the newspaper, well, maybe not. In the United States, we had a pattern where newspapers were big cash makers, huge money makers. And so the old kind of crotchety owner that you always hated, usually the guy, he lived in the big house on the top of the hill, but you could go throw a tomato at it, right? He sold the paper to a group of investors who don't even know they own it, but they do know they want 35% profits every year, no matter what. And as advertising began to flee newspapers, and it has, our newspapers are emptied out of classified advertising, but also a lot of display advertising, not because of the internet, by the way. This is the great fantasy that we have. The internet, we're getting beat because somebody created some new technology. New technology is always a scary thing. Well, the fact is our decline in advertising in newspapers began in the 1990s, early 1990s, before anybody had a laptop. And intriguingly enough, our decline in circulation in newspapers in the United States started in the early 1950s as a percentage of population. So newspapers in the United States have been in decline for a long time, increasingly becoming elite journals for a small portion of society that was willing to pay for them, whereas most of society getting its information from television. And as this has happened, right, the owners of papers became increasingly reliant on the advertising to sustain the journalism, more reliant than they'd actually historically been. When the advertising began to pull away, what did they do? Remember, distant owners didn't care about their communities. Well, in the last year, in the United States, they closed 140 newspapers. 140 daily and weekly newspapers across the United States have closed. Not just small papers, not just secondary papers, major daily newspapers in Seattle, in Denver, in Albuquerque, in Tucson, in communities across the United States. The Christian Science Monitor, one of our 3 national dailies, closed down, just stopped printing. And so we've had a dramatic decrease in the number of papers in the United States. But that's not the ugly part. The ugly part is the ones that have stayed open. And across the country, we have newspapers that exist as Potemkin villages rather than actual journalistic enterprises. They have culled out their reporting to such an extent. They closed their foreign bureaus, they've closed their Washington bureaus, they've closed their state house bureaus, they've stopped covering their communities, and we have an aggregate of the number of journalists who've lost their jobs. For the last 2 years in the United States, newspapers have shed more than 1,500 employees a month, every month for the last 2 years. We've lost more than 30,000 newspaper employees in the United States in the last 2 years. And remember, we only have 46,000 journalists working for daily newspapers in the U.S. So 30,000 newspaper employees lost in the last 2 years. An incredible culling out of the profession because distant owners are going to get that 35% profit no matter what it takes, no matter how little journalism is done. Now, when you talk about this stuff, it can be daunting. You say, wow, it's kind of too bad for the United States. Glad I don't live there. But there's something more to be conscious of. We, as a country, we are incredibly good at exporting our pathologies. We teach other countries to do what we do. And the fact of the matter is that the models for culling out journalists are playing out in countries around the world. They have not played out to such an extent in Australia. But I want to emphasize, they will. If you don't believe that, you are living in a fantasy world. Because someday a manager is going to show up and say, we could do this with half as many journalists. If they have, I know that in some cases they already have. But I want to emphasize why I think it matters so much. And that is that if we were just talking about journalists losing their jobs, right? That's a bummer. It's sad. I'm a journalist. My friends are journalists. I don't want us to lose jobs. But that's not really what we're talking about here. That's sad, journalists losing jobs. Media changing, that's tough, that's difficult, that's complicated. But those are business page stories, right? The front page story, the real news for society, is what this does to democracy. And this is not an American phenomenon. It is not a developed world phenomenon. Journalism is intricately linked to democracy in every place in the world. There's nowhere where journalism isn't the underpinning of democracy. Now, journalism may be practiced in many different ways. Online, in print, broadcast. It may be still an oral tradition. Journalism was rooted in the oral tradition. But the bottom line is, when someone gets information that power doesn't want and communicates it to the powerless, they are committing the act of journalism. And when we dramatically decrease the number of people who do that act in a country, we dramatically decrease the ability of citizens to get the information they need. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, author of our Bill of Rights, or author of our Declaration of Independence, said it best. There's a wonderful quote that's above the door of every newspaper in America. It says, given the choice between having government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I would always choose the latter. I would always choose the newspapers because you can't have a democracy, you can't have a free society without the newspaper. Now, you'd think from that quote that Jefferson loved newspapers. He hated them. He despised them. He said after he left the White House that if he never read another newspaper for the rest of his life, he would be a happy man. So why would he say we have to have them? What is it? Well, because if you read the rest of the letter saying given the choice between government and newspapers, it was to his friend of his named Edward Carrington. He says, because the only thing that will separate us from the monarchies of old Europe is a free press, is journalism. Because in the monarchies of old Europe, kings and viscounts and kaisers and czars controlled information. And in that control of information, they assured that the wolves would always devour the sheep. And Jefferson, being very literal, said, let me explain that to you, Edward Carrington. What I mean when I say the wolves would devour the sheep, I am not talking about animals. I am saying the rich, will control the poor. There will be a class divide, Jefferson explained it, in every country in the world, and that divide will be dramatically reinforced to an extent that there will be no real democracy without journalism. So, where does this leave us? Well, I would suggest it leaves us in relatively dire straits, because in America, where I live, the great mass of people are increasingly cut off from information about their local, state, and national governments. And let me give you an example also of why that's a little scary, but the next turn of the page is even more frightening. There's a new study from Baltimore, Maryland. The second we leave the country, we forget the states. It's very interesting. Baltimore, Maryland, a wonderful city, great old classic American city. And the Pew Center, which is one of our great research centers, went out and studied journalism in Baltimore. And they said, okay, how do people get their information? It was an incredibly liberal study. They asked all the ways that you could get information. They studied the newspapers, radio, television, blogs, online news sites, even Twitter, because the police department would send out tweets when they arrested people. And so they studied even that as breaking news information. Studied all the different sources. Say, where do people in Baltimore, Maryland get their information right now? Because they especially wanted to see if new media was filling the void created by all the layoffs in old media. Well, what they found out was an interesting thing. First off, old media, the daily newspaper, is still the primary source of information in Baltimore, Maryland. After all the cuts, after everything we've been through, the Baltimore Sun, still the primary source. Now, the Baltimore Sun, when I was a kid, had a dozen foreign bureaus and one of the largest Washington bureaus in the country. They no longer have any foreign bureaus at all, and I think they have one person in Washington. So they've cut back dramatically. But it's still the primary source. But here's the interesting thing. They quantified. They went back 10 and 20 years. The Baltimore Sun, primary source of information, is producing 33% fewer stories today than it did 10 years ago. It is producing 73% fewer stories than it did 20 years ago. Primary source of information, but giving you dramatically less information. So then they said, well, this void must be filled by new media. So they went out and they looked at all the possible sources for journalism coming out, all the information coming. What they found was 96% of the stories in Baltimore during the period they studied were produced by old media, by the newspaper, television, radio. Only 4% coming from new media. Now, it isn't that people that work in new media don't try. It's that there are no resources there. New media is not being provided with the resources or the vehicles to begin to go out and do that day-to-day intensive journalism that informs the community. And we found this to be true across the country. Bob and I, when we were doing our book, studied cities across the country. The same thing. Wonderful, committed journalists trying to start a blog, trying to start a... So we begin the book, actually, with the story of a laid-off, great award-winning laid-off American journalist who started a blog with another journalist. And she did it for 6 months. And then she decided that, she had gotten model thin. Now she wanted to eat enough to survive. And so we see this happens all the time. And so 96% old media, 4% new media. But old media producing dramatically less journalism. Where's our information coming from? And this is the scary part about the Pew study. Pew said there's really two ways that we get our information. One way is the traditional image of journalism, and that is this wonderful woman right here with the glasses turns to this woman next to her and says, hey, you look like a journalist. You got the little tag, you got a pen and stuff like that. We've got a problem in my neighborhood. There's a toxic waste dump or something because the kids are getting sick, and I called the mayor, I called the state government, I called everybody, nothing is happening. You need to go write about it, journalist. And this is your job. This is what you do for a living. You're not doing 3 other jobs during the day, putting your kids to sleep, and then trying to blog at night. This is your job. You are a journalist. Go out and write about this problem. And so journalist, you go out and you write about it. You ask questions. You look back at records. You use all the skills and all the training you have, and you find out there was a toxic waste dump there. You go to the mayor. You speak truth to power, and something happens, right? That's the old way. That's one way that we think of information coming to people. The other way is power speaks its truth to us. They hold a press conference, they put a video news release out, they in some way manage a story to make us talk about it. Power decides what the debate is, what we should be thinking about it, what the parameters of the debate are. They basically frame our discourse. Pew studied how many stories came from traditional journalism model, how many from power speaking to us. It's bad news, folks. 86% of the stories were power speaking Only 14% fit that traditional journalism model. And you think, well, wow, that's really rough for Baltimore. We studied cities across the United States. Across the United States, in 1960, we had one journalist for every one public relations person in the U.S. In 1980, we had one journalist for every 1.2 public relations people in the U.S. Today, we have one journalist for every 4 public relations people in the U.S., a 4-to-1 ratio. Now, I'm not good with math, but 86-14, 4-to-1, are we beginning to see a pattern here? Power has always spoken its truth, but now power is shouting. And power is shouting out every other voice. It is dominating our discourse to such an extent, that if George Orwell were to come for the first time to the United States, if George Orwell were to come and take a look at this circumstance, he would say, when I wrote 1984, I thought the really scary thing, the thing that would horrify people, was Big Brother is watching you. I didn't understand. The really scary thing, the really horrifying thing, is you are watching Big Brother. 24/7, round-the-clock news, crime, sports, weather, tips so you can be less fat, but very, very little journalism. Very, very little of the information you need to govern your own affairs. Very, very little of the underpinning of democracy. So why do I come to Australia to talk about this? Shouldn't I be at the battlements in America? Yeah, well, we are. We're fighting as hard as we can, and we've had a tremendous battle. We have a group called Free Press in the United States that's organized hundreds of thousands of folks around these issues, and we're banging at it every day. But we are also speaking to the rest of the world because we don't want you to follow down our path. And we think that Australia especially is in a unique situation. You have the ABC, you have a relatively stable journalism, and frankly, you have a lot better economy than we have right now. And I'm going to suggest just a couple things that I think you might want to consider as I finish up my remarks, but also as you think about what you need to do here to avoid the circumstance we have, and also, I think, to frame out the models that will work for the 21st century. First off, you need to understand that there is an absolutely fundamental change taking place in journalism. This is the biggest change, not just of our lifetimes, but of many, many lifetimes. Journalism is going to be fundamentally different when you die than it was when you were born. How it's practiced, how it's framed, almost every aspect of it will be different. The problem is that as this change is taking place, it is not in any sense being guided by journalists. Right now, this change is being guided by budget writers, by economic folks, the people who write the budget for an operation, and also by people who develop technology. It is not being guided anywhere by journalists. And journalists need to get out in front of these changes. They need to be defining some of them, or we will be defined into a corner that will ultimately create a new order that is not merely unjournalistic, that might well be anti-journalistic and overtly propagandistic. Because if you think about the reality of the future, it's not going to be no information. There will be more information. We know that. There will be more information than we've ever had. There will be a cacophony. It's just how that information is organized and who is organizing it. And if it's not journalists organizing it for the purpose of democracy, as romantic and as foolish as that kid who rode his bike down Main Street in Union Grove when I was 11 years old, if it's not journalists doing that, somebody's going to be doing it for money. They're going to be making a lot of money to do it, and the people that are going to pay them a lot of money to do it aren't going to want to have an unattractive result for their bottom line. This is a simple calculus, but when you put that into play, then I think there's a couple things that ought to be first priorities here. Number one, the ABC is a treasure, whether you like it or hate it. If you like it, it's a treasure you want to make, just build it up, make it better. If you hate it, you want to make it better, but you sure don't want to get rid of it, because it is that frame around which you build so many other things. The ABC needs to be dramatically better funded, and it also needs to be dramatically more innovative. ABC operations around Australia need to be seen as platforms on which you build out journalism for communities and states across this country. And that journalism is largely non-broadcast. It should be largely digital, and in fact, I see the existing public broadcasting systems of countries around the world as the frame around which we can build and hopefully get funding and resources to a lot of journalism. Secondly, Journalists need to get in the forefront of the intellectual and legislative struggles to define new ownership models. The old ownership models are dying in every country around the world. It's not just the United States. In England, right, their newspapers are surviving because Russian oligarchs are coming and buying them. That is not there are not enough Russian oligarchs to sustain journalism internationally. They like to live in London. That's why they're going there. But the fact is, we can't think that that's going to be our model for the 21st century. We need new ownership models that will function for journalism. And most of these will have to have a legislative component to them. There may need to be tax breaks. There may need to be structural shifts to make it easier for co-ops, for communities, for groups of journalists to own not just a newspaper, but perhaps a website, a broadcast outlet, all of the different functions. And yes, we have to explore the idea of government subsidies with a seriousness that accepts that you can have government resources directed, taxpayer resources, citizen resources, directed to the production of journalism in a way that does not make that journalism subservient to government. In fact, surveys from around the world in countries where you do have high levels of subsidy, particularly Scandinavian countries, show that there, with sufficient resources, journalism is more questioning of government than in the countries where it is limited in its resources. So when we talk about these new ownership models, one of the aspects of that is to ask where the resources will come from, and it is reasonable to say that in some cases they will come from citizens and taxpayers. Let's say very quickly, you've talked about it a little bit already, journalists need to, the Media Alliance has to have its own apps operation. Journalists need to be developing their own apps. Apps should not be developed by commercial entities and then sold to journalists or sold to news outlets. I'll tell you why. I've been to the Silicon Valley. The smartest people in the world are being paid to develop technology that takes eyes away from journalism, not that moves eyes to journalism. And if you think oh, wow, that guy, what a conspiracy theory. Go to any news website and tap on an ad. When you tap on the ad on a news website, and there aren't enough of them to sustain any news website today, but when you do tap on that ad, where does it take you? Does it take you deeper into the journalism? No, it takes you away to something that is more entertaining, right? And the person who developed that technology didn't develop it to help journalism. They developed it to make money, to get your eyes away, and they are a success if you stay away. They are a failure if you come back to the news website. So if we understand that in developing apps, our primary job is to develop the technology that is journalistic, that draws people to the website, that takes people away from the ads and to what we do. Simple model here. We need to develop apps that are civic and democratic in their purpose, not commercial and entertaining in their purpose. Our journalism may be entertaining, it may be exciting, but our primary purpose has to be to get people to it, not to move people away from it. Finally, we have to start training bloggers. The most absurd thing in the world is this concept that training is all about helping old journalists figure out how to turn their computer on. Fine, that's great. Most people who into journalism are smart enough to figure out how to do it, and even maybe to use their phone. But the future of journalism is going to be young people doing blogging, doing online work, and they need to have a tremendous amount of training, not on how to transfer the bad habits of old journalism to a new medium, but how to do a journalism that fits in the 21st century, that functions in the 21st century, but is at core civic and democratic. And so there needs to be a massive new training of the people who will produce our journalism in the future. So, minor asks of you. And let me close off with a thought from, Chris keeps talking about 100 years ago they formed this union. Fabulous. I'm thrilled with that. I like anniversaries. It's also 100 years ago that a group of unions in Sydney and around the country of Australia tried to form a chain of labor and working class dailies across the country. And they didn't fully succeed. They created a number of them. Many of the cities across the country did have labor dailies. But in their advertising to get support for it, they asked a fundamental set of questions. They said, who owns the press and why? When you read your daily paper, are you reading facts or propaganda? And whose propaganda? Who furnishes the raw material for your thoughts about life? Is it honest material? No man or woman can ask more important questions than these. It's 100 years ago. Is it honest material or is it propaganda? This is ever the same struggle. But our job Our fundamental job, journalists in America, journalists in Australia, wherever you are, is to let the answer be in print, in broadcast, and online, that our information will be furnished by journalists, not by propagandists, that our media will serve not just the powerful, but the powerless, that we will make real the promise of democracy, that there is no freedom of the press unless there are enough journalists with enough authority to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. There is no freedom of the press unless the sheep have as much information and power as the wolves. We fight in the name of Tom Paine. We fight in the name of Henry Boot. We fight in the name of George Orwell himself. We fight for journalism. We fight for democracy, and we will prevail because the only voice louder than the voice of power is the voice that speaks truth to power. If there is to be a future for America, if there is to be a future for Australia, there must be journalists who speak truth to power. Go out and do it. Thank you very much.